Blumhouse, you've done it again. Imaginary is a PG-13 horror mystery movie directed by Jeff Wadlow and starring DeWanda Wise as the main character, Jessica. The story mainly revolves around Jessica, who moves back into her childhood home with her new family to help raise the kids, which are not hers. She is the stepmother in this movie to two children, Alice and Taylor, played by Pyper, Bruan, and Taegen Burns. Now, as I said, this home that they're moving into at the very beginning of the movie was the childhood home of the main character, Jessica. And quickly after they move into this home, the youngest daughter, Alice, wanders into the basement where she finds a crawl space, and inside that crawl space, she finds a teddy bear in which she names Chauncey. Now, Chauncey starts out as your typical imaginary friend that any child would have. Family doesn't pay too much attention to it. The mother doesn't pay too much attention to it. She actually finds it pretty cute at the start of the movie. But then things start to happen around the house. Alice starts to act differently. She takes on a different persona that kind of makes the mother wonder what the heck is going on. And you start to see signs that maybe this teddy bear imaginary friend isn't so imaginary after all. Now, I should mention that throughout the movie, there are connections made with the main character, Jessica, back to her past, where something similar to this happened to Jessica when she's a child, because it constantly brings up her father in the movie. Her father now lives in some sort of nursing home, home for the mentally ill, because her father, the movie alludes to the fact that her father was affected by this evil imaginary friend spirit trying to protect Jessica when she was a younger child. And so something happened there that the movie doesn't make totally clear. You start to put the pieces together towards the end of the movie, but Jessica once encountered this imaginary friend herself. It's just that it takes the entire movie for her to remember that all of this happened. And I'll talk about that in my negatives in a little bit, because I felt like there was a lot of issues with this movie, but that's the general plot for you. So Chauncey, the imaginary friend, sends Alice, the youngest daughter, on a scavenger hunt to do all these things that would then bring Alice into this magical underworld. And it's a scavenger list of something that scares you, something that makes you happy, something that hurts you. And it even asks Alice to hurt herself. And there's a scene in the movie where she tries to impale herself with a rusty nail. And it's some sort of a phenomenon too. Like, it's not just a one-off imaginary friend situation either, because there's a part in the movie where they bring in a counselor or mental health, counselor to kind of talk to Alice and see what's going on. She doesn't know what's going on, even though she shows a video to the mother of a case that she had, which was very similar, where another child cut off his thumb because his imaginary friend told him to. But I'll get into all that a little bit later. Anyway, Alice goes on the scavenger hunt, gets taken into the underworld by this imaginary friend, teddy bear Chauncey, and then the mother, as well as the older sister, Taylor, have to go in and save her. Now, there's a little bit of a subplot here in this movie with the family dynamic, because the older sister, Taylor, doesn't really like the stepmother, Jessica, because it's not her real mom. They have a real mom who makes a couple appearances throughout the movie. She presumably has a drug problem or something going on in the background, which is why the father divorced her, yada, yada. But it's your typical relationship that you would see in a movie between a stepdaughter and a stepmom. Stepdaughter isn't too welcoming to the stepmom, but the youngest daughter, Alice, is very trusting, very loving towards Jessica, who is her stepmother. And so there is a moment in this movie where they have to go and save Alice, where Taylor, despite her dislike for her stepmother, just has to put her ego aside and help save her young. Now, that's kind of the gist of this movie. I'm not going to get into too many other details, not going to try to spoil anything, but that's the gist of this movie. Now let's get into the positives and the negatives of Imaginary. Now, I'm going to start with the negatives because I feel like I have more to say with the negatives, and that's not to say that this is a terrible movie. I think it's in that 5 to 6 stars out of 10 solid range. It's okay, but there's a lot of flaws here. Now, the main gripe I've seen a lot of other critics have with this movie is the dialogue, and I have to 100% agree with that. The dialogue in this movie is just very cringeworthy at times. The movie feels the need to explain a lot of things to you through the way that the characters talk, and the characters talk in very abnormally, for lack of a better term, like a lack of emotion in what they're saying, and it seems like the tone at times doesn't fit what's going on in the movie. But it's not the character's fault. It's not the actor's fault, in my opinion. I feel like the dialogue does a disservice to the characters in this movie because some people are going to mistake it for bad acting when it's not bad acting. I feel like DeWanda Wise is very good. I feel like Taegen Burns is very good. Hell, the little girl is a hell of an actor for how old she is, but the dialogue in this movie was just very cringeworthy at times. My second really big gripe with this movie was the number of unnecessary characters. So, first of all, there's a dad in this movie, the dad to the two children, and he remarries Jessica, who becomes the stepmom, who's the main character. Besides that fact, there is zero reason for the dad to be in this movie. He's only there to kind of provide the dynamic of these two girls being stepdaughters and the older stepdaughter kind of taking a disliking to her stepmom. Outside of that, there was no need for the stepdad in this movie, and you could have done the exact same thing and cut out some unnecessary runtime with the dad by just making Jessica a single mother in this movie. Then there's the old lady. There's an old lady in this movie, a neighbor lady, who was a babysitter for Jessica when she was a lot younger. And of course, Jessica's moving back into her childhood home. Doesn't quite remember this babysitter when she introduces herself. But this old lady babysitter, I'm not even sure if I should be calling the old lady in this movie an unnecessary character, because her character, I feel like, could have been done right. It's just that the execution was absolutely awful. But the old lady enters this movie when she reintroduces herself to Jessica as her former babysitter when she was a little kid and lived in the house in her childhood days. And she's like, oh my gosh, I used to babysit you. Jessica doesn't remember her at all. And the old lady's like, I used to babysit for you. You were so little. Your imagination used to run wild, all this stuff. She comes in a little bit later in the movie and eventually reveals that she knows everything that's going on inside the house with the imaginary friend and how Chauncey is actually a real evil spirit, all this. And she's just sitting on this information for the entire movie until the end when the sister gets abducted by the imaginary friend. And it's like, okay, so you were just sitting on this information for the entire movie, right? Kind of weird. She becomes consumed with Chauncey, the imaginary bear, and she claims that ever since Jessica moved out of the house and what happened to their dad and the mother died, that she's been doing research on the topic, and it's like, what the hell? And then the old lady comes with them into the underworld, right, to go and save the little sister. And when they get there, the old lady is just enamored more with the imaginary underworld than she is with saving Alice. And she is obsessed with that, and then she shuts the door that supposedly was their way back into the real world and tries to trap them in there. Her character just goes completely crazy and then gets killed. Okay, gets killed by Chauncey the teddy bear. There's only one death in this entire movie, and it's the old lady. And I mean, I guess that's the only good part about her character, is that she ends up dying, because I really don't know what she was doing here. And then I mentioned the terrible dialogue. A lot of the terrible dialogue came from her. In fact, there was one point in which they were trying to light the bowl on fire with all the stuff from the scavenger hunt that's supposed to allow you to enter this imaginary world. And when it doesn't work the first time, she goes, well, I guess it didn't work because you need to inflict real pain. And it's like, no shit, lady. A lot of no shit lines from her in this movie. Just awful. All right, my last really big problem with this movie is the main character, Jessica, and how it also takes her the entire movie to be like, oh yeah, I remember all this now. I remember when I had an imaginary friend named Chauncey, and then she starts painting the walls where she used to paint the walls, I guess, for Chauncey because she told her to as a kid, and it had all the scavenger list stuff from when she was a kid, and she was like, oh my gosh, yeah, it all just came back to me. Even though it's the sole reason why her father is now in a mental institution, but she doesn't remember anything that happened or what could have possibly caused that incident. There's just some plot holes in this movie. There's some bad execution with the script writing. And Jeff Wadlow, who has had some hit or miss movies, I would say this one was definitely a miss when it came to actually writing the script and writing the story. They could have done a lot with it. I mean, those are my main negatives. I can easily transition into the positives here because I felt like the concept of Chauncey the bear and this imaginary world and how these imaginary friends feed on the imagination of young children is really interesting, really intriguing. You can do a lot with it. And I felt like the bare bones to having a good horror movie was there. I felt like the little girl Alice as well as her older sister Taylor were both very good in this movie. I had already mentioned that, especially the little girl, again, for how young she is. I don't think acting was an issue in this movie at all. I also think the teddy bear, which they used for the Chauncey the bear character in this movie, they don't overdo it or anything. It's just a simple looking old teddy bear, but it's an eerie vibe that you get with it. It just makes subtle movements. It's not like Annabelle with a haunted doll that runs around the house by itself. That's not really what the bear does, but it does just enough to kind of creep you out. And the interesting part about this bear, too, is that only Jessica and younger children can see it. Because there's a point in this movie where it's revealed that this entire time Taylor, the mental therapist, all these people, they cannot see the bear, and they're like, what are you talking about? What bear? And it really puts a cool twist on this movie that makes it even more challenging to try and figure out what is going on. Also, I haven't seen a lot of people talk about this, but the tune or the theme song that they use for Chauncey the bear in this movie is very catchy, will get stuck in your head after this movie, and is a big positive for me because I feel like any horror movie where you have an antagonist, a badass theme song or an eerie tune or something that sticks with you after you walk out of the theater is really cool. I mean, that's something that's going to make you remember this movie. It's going to make you want to go back and watch it. So that was a nice thing I noticed about this movie too. But those are my positives and those are my negatives. I'm going to send you guys off with the conclusion for this movie. So I would put it where most other critics are putting it, in that kind of 5 or 6 out of 10 category. It's not terrible. It's not great. It's your run-of-the-mill Blumhouse horror movie, PG-13 horror movie. That's the other thing about this, is it's PG-13 horror. PG-13 horror is kind of a niche market. Sure, you can get your kids into horror watching this movie. And also, if you're a parent that wants to take your kid to see a horror movie in the PG-13 category, this is a good one, because I know with Megan, which was also a Blumhouse production, Megan had a lot of gore in it and a lot of violence in it, even for a PG-13 movie. It was kind of bordering on rated R, and I think the original plan for Megan was to make it rated R. Not nearly as much of that in this movie. If you're a parent wondering if this is a good movie for your child, I think younger kids will be just fine with this. There's only one kill, like I said. It's the old lady, and they don't even really show anything. All they show is her going behind a door and then a pool of blood going under the door. So it's really not that bad. Also, you can't have a Blumhouse movie without a twist ending. There's a twist ending in it. I won't give it away. I mean, it's nothing too unpredictable, but there is a twist ending. So yeah, run-of-the-mill Blumhouse movie. Nothing too special. Not bad. If you have kids and you got nothing to do this weekend, sure, give it a shot.